Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's EBC video. We're in Lakeville, Minnesota this week at Grace Community Bible Church. The reason we're here is, if you don't know, this building used to be the home of St. John's. And we're thinking about history, we're thinking about our links to the past as we think about Matthew 1 verses 1 through 17. Right? Matthew starts the story, and it's the first thing in the New Testament, with the genealogy of Jesus going all the way back to Abraham. And one of the reasons we kind of suspect that that's being done is because the prophecies had said that Jesus, as the Messiah, would come from the house of David, from that line. And as we see what happens in this reporting of 42 generations from Abraham all the way to Jesus, we see all of these names about the connections that exist by the time you get to Jesus. And you hear names that we're familiar with, like Abraham, of course, like Judah, like David, and then we get to Mary and Joseph, and there's that connection. Just like we have connection with the community in Lakeville for 110 years, and the history being in this building from 1964 until much more recently. And then before this building, there had been a building in 1924, and all of the celebrations that we've had in our history in our links to community. Now, that's one aspect of this genealogy. But there's another aspect here, and I want to focus for just a moment on what else we know about some of these names. Just like our family trees, where not every person in the list would necessarily have always been their best self at every moment, there's a lot of stories in this list that are not that great, right? We know, for instance, about Jacob, and Jacob wrestles with God, and we actually think quite a lot about Jacob because not only does he wrestle with God, but his sons become the tribes of Israel. And yet Jacob is somebody who actually stole that birthright from Esau, and nothing that happens next would have happened without Jacob stealing that birthright. And yet Jacob is the start of those tribes of Israel. We know King David in the story in which he's a shepherd boy, and he goes on to beat Goliath, and then he goes on to be the king of Israel. And you know what? He had a lot of failings too, including one really big one, in which he steals the wife of Uriah and then has Uriah killed. And the genealogy that's here in Matthew leans into that story by actually describing the fact that David is there, and then that there's a son, and it's through the wife of Uriah. It's not like they try to hide it. It's not like they don't want to mention it. It's right there. There's failings involved in what happens here. There are women in this genealogy as well, which is what I would say odd for the time, because genealogies didn't go through women. But there's a point to be made in that as well, that there are women who are important in the story. And in fact, oftentimes it's the women who are foreigners, like Ruth, who was a foreigner, but who is considered to be one of the most righteous, pious people, faithful people in all of this genealogy. And you've got other women as well who were prostitutes, turned into heroes in the Battle of Jericho. You've got, of course, the Virgin Mary at the end of it all. And there's something about that, by the way, because when you start in Matthew, it's verses 1 through 17. The very next verse, verse 18, also says that it was the Holy Spirit who winds up with the Virgin Mary having Jesus as the baby. And so we know that this story, even though it's describing the lineage of Jesus, is not describing necessarily just a blood lineage. It's describing a connection to all of the important people that are a part of this story so that it gets to Jesus. And it's super important for our lives to be thinking about that. And while we're in this series about growing in generosity, I want to focus on it this way for just a moment, that when we think about all of the people in that story, every one of them had their own story. And no way for 42 generations to know that they were a part of this bigger story to get to Jesus. But they were. And not only did they have great things in their stories, but they had terrible things in their story. And they're still part of the story of Jesus. And as we think about our giving, as we think about our lives, we have our own life here. We do some things great and some things not so great. And yet God still has us in his purpose for now and for a huge connection to all of the rest of God's story. So everyone, have a ton of confidence that you can live joyfully knowing that there's something for you to do today, and sometimes you'll get it and sometimes you won't, but God still got it right there for you. So everyone, have a great week.